So I'm going to start with the idea of what a shadow is. We're going to look at how to add shadows to objects that don't have shadows yet, and what can we do to make them have shadows and other things. So the first thing is the idea of what a shadow is. Now, it depends on what kind of lighting and where you want us to believe a shadow is. Indoors, it tends to be diffused a little bit more. Outdoor, it tends to be a little bit more crisp. So what we're going to do to start is we're just going to take this soccer ball here. Let's get in a little closer. Take this soccer ball, and I'm going to put shadows on it in a variety of different ways so you can kind of see the impact that a shadow can have. The very first thing that a lot of people tell you how to do shadows, and we're going to look at this way, is to take the selection of the soccer ball itself, and we're going to fill it with black, and then we're going to distort it to be kind of a flattened circle. So you make a selection, so I can use Command, click on that, and that makes the selection. We're going to do a new layer, Command-Shift-N, call this shadow, and I'm going to fill it with black. Okay. We're going to move this down here. You can get your free transform, which is Command-T, and then you can do distort. Right, so we're going to go ahead and work this, and we're going to bring it down flat. You see how I can create this flatter look to it? We'll bring this out a little bit, and then we'll do OK. Very basic, creating a shadow now. This looks like it's kind of up in the air, right? If this was sitting like that, that doesn't look like a very believable shadow. There's no real light source that's happening, and shadows would diffuse. Shadows would get longer. They would be definitely more intense underneath this part because it's curved, and lessen as it goes out. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about doing. That shows a different form. It's a different kind of light. It's a little bit more of a diffused shadow, so there would also be a shadow kind of underneath. So we're going to take a look at how to create something like this, and then we'll put it down on the ground and switch the lighting. So the very first thing is we're going to do that same thing. We're going to select it, which is Command and click on that layer. We'll do a new layer, fill with black, bring it down here. We're going to go ahead and do free transform and distort. Bring these in just a little bit. The middle piece goes down. These extend outward. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and blur that. Let's bring this in here. I am going to make that a smart object so I can adjust the filter if I need to. And so we're going to do blur, Gaussian blur. Right, so wait a minute. That kind of blurs it that way, but I don't know if that's really what I want. Maybe I want a little bit of that blur to start, but I really want it to expand outwards, and that blur is not really doing it. So you can go back to blur and do motion blur, right? And let's do it pretty flat. And you can see now as I move that out, I can get a different kind of blur. It's a little bit more of a wider blur, right? So that kind of extends a little bit outward, and I could adjust that Gaussian blur kind of if I want to. Right? I could, in fact, stack these a little bit differently if it allowed me. So we get motion blur, we get the Gaussian blur on top of it, and there you have a little bit more of a, something else is happening with that. Now, you can make a selection, none of that. Let's make a selection of the soccer ball, and let's say the light is coming from above. That means there would be a shadow underneath. So I'm going to fill this soccer ball with complete black, get a mask, and get a brush here, and I'll just tone this, right? And you can see now there's a shadow underneath, which gives us some dimension. The light's coming from here and creating this shadow underneath. Those are the steps we're going to use to create more things like this, and like this, and like that, and a bigger shadow going backwards, right? These are the ideas that we're going to kind of work on. So we're going to take this one here, and take the soccer ball, and we're going to move this up just a little bit here. Now to start, let's just take a look at the shadow for a second, which really kind of a blurry thing, kind of what we talked about. It's just a little bit of motion blur, Gaussian blur, and that soccer ball sits right? Pretty good. There, we can give a little shadow kind of underneath. So this is kind of on the ground from above. Let's just take a look on how that was created. So the first thing is make that selection, Command click, and we're going to do a new layer and we'll fill it with black. Okay, so let's take the soccer ball. Let's move it up for a second here. We're going to stick this. Oops, we're going to stick this shadow underneath, and we're going to distort. See how we can just kind of bring. You can even bring that down, and then we are going to go to filter, blur. Let's do a little bit of a motion blur to it, and then filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Oh, I forgot to make it a smart filter, but you'll get the idea here. And then I'm going to drop this down over top of it like that. And let's say I wanted to add a light source, so that's coming from above again. So Command click on it, fill that, and we are going to get something like that. Okay. Now, that's all fine and good. The one problem is that a lot of shadows right underneath, this is really super intense, right underneath where that soccer ball is. This is kind of wishy-washy in its look. So we're going to take the same idea, which I probably should have duplicated beforehand. Right, so I'm just going to duplicate that sitting on top of each other. You can see kind of what that does. I'm then going to put a mask and kind of just take, all I really want is that dark area in the middle. Right, that sits a lot better on there. Now, okay, so we did that with distort and all that. Let me show you what I think is a faster way. So this is taking this brush, and if we bring up our brushes palette, and brushes palette, I'm going to do a brush tip shape, and I'm going to squeeze that. So that's almost pretty flat, and I can sit this kind of underneath this and just click a couple times, and you can see I get a better, I think you get a better shadow. Now maybe I went one click too far, but you get that idea, much better shadow. Yeah. So let's say I wanted to kind of switch this and have it look like the light's actually hitting from here, casting a shadow this way. Well, you can see I just moved that shadow. Now it wouldn't be completely like this because that looks strange. There'd be a little bit of a shadow sitting in front of the ball, but just a little bit because the light source is really coming from here. However, this would need to change. Right? So now our light source is coming from over here. So this, oops, that doesn't work right. Let's make sure we get the rest. So the light source is coming from here. So we want a little bit of that hitting the soccer ball. The darkness is on the left-hand side. And now this kind of feels like it's actually on the ground and it's doing that. You could do the same thing going the other way. Let's take that same shadow, shift it over here, and we're going to take this shadow and just do the reverse. And you can see now there's some dimension happening to the soccer ball. So let's take a look at a bigger shadow like this. Now, more of this cast, right? So the shadow is actually coming at an angle, or the light's coming at an angle, so my shadow should be moved kind of backwards, right? So that's kind of elongating this same thing. So let's take a look at a couple ways we did before. Let's take a look at this brush here. Could I take that same brush, click a couple times kind of outside of that, take it and angle this a little bit? What's interesting, here's what's fascinating. That's not right. But here's what's fascinating is this now looks like this is at an angle. This looks like the ball is actually rolling backwards because of where I placed that shadow. This shadow needs to be a little bit, right? So there's actually 3 shadows working here. So you have this larger one that's sitting in the background, right? That's really fuzzy. And that's just taking the circle and squashing it and blurring it. You have this one that's sitting a little bit more there. So what this is adding is a little bit of depth to it, right? That's So this is multiplied or just kind of placed on top of it. And then you have this shadow sitting underneath here. And you can see there's not a harder edge that's over here. And the reason is because if I just had the shadow like this, with the really kind of harder edge here, you can see how it looks like the soccer ball is tilted and rolling backwards. But with these lights, or these shadows, it looks like it's a little bit more grounded on the ground. So grounded on the ground, that's fine. So a lot of times you'll have to build up shadows, and that's what, I know this was a long video, that's what we'll get into in a little bit, is about showing how to get more than one shadow layer to make it more interesting. Now, we get into that more when we're dealing with more on a colored background, because there's different kind of steps to the shadow.